explaining the Hundred Years' War. Between 1316 and 1328, 3 kings of France would die without any sons. This would leave Edward III of England, the nephew of the previous kings, next in line for the throne. The French nobility were unwilling to see Edward become the next king, so with the help of the Avignon papacy, Philip VI would replace Edward as the next king. Edward would reluctantly accept Philip as king and would pay homage to him. He had to do this, however, as he held territory within France, just as all English kings had since the Norman invasion of 1066. The English used to hold a great deal of territory within France, but by then they only held Gascony. Initially, the agreement would work out, but that would only last until the 1330s. The English would begin to fear a French-Scottish alliance known as the Old Alliance. This would begin when Philip allowed King David of Scotland to take refuge within France. The French would then become angered at the English when they allowed Robert of Artois, a claimant to the French throne and declared mortal enemy of France, to seek refuge inside of England. So, to challenge Edward, Philip would send a fleet into the English Channel, and in 1337, he would revoke the English's claim on Gascony. To counter this, in 1840, Edward would once again claim the French throne, and would begin to form alliances with the nobility of the Low Countries. With their help, the English would turn out victorious at the Battle of Sluys and would once again gain control of the English Channel. The war would spill into Brittany, where a claimant to the throne, John of Montfort, would gain English backing. This would become the Breton Succession War, where they would fight the French-backed Charles of Blois. In July of 1346, Edward had gained a very large army and would invade Normandy. The English would then fight in the Battle of Crécy and decimate the French. However, the war would then be halted by the arrival of the Black Death in Europe. While this was going on, Philip would die and would be succeeded by John II in 1350. After that ended, hostilities would return when the son of Edward, the Black Prince, would arrive in Gascony in 1356. They would then crush the French at the Battle of Poitiers and would capture John II. With John in captivity, France would go into a state of lawlessness. However, the English would be unable to capitalize this. So, after failing to take Rheims, in 1360 they would sign the Treaty of Brittany, which expanded their claims inside of France. John's ransom would never be paid, and so he would go on to die inside of England, leaving the new King Charles with a lot to deal with. In the 1360s, the English-backed Montforts would win inside of Brittany. Charles II of Navarre tried and failed at claiming the Burgundian throne, and civil war would erupt in Castile. Although Charles V supported the Castile claimant, Henry of Trastamara, the Black Prince would help Peter of Castile maintain power. However, this was a costly military excursion, and this would cause the Black Prince to raise taxes. This would anger his lords in Gascony, who would then appeal to Charles for help. Charles would call the Black Prince to Paris to settle the issue, but he would refuse. Because of this, in 1369, English ownership of Gascony would be revoked once again. The hostilities would continue. However, in this new phase of the war, the English had become weak, so Henry of Trastamara would take the throne of Castile, the peasants would revolt, and both the Black Prince and Edward III would die. This would leave the Black Prince's young son, Richard II, as the new king. Because of this, the English would be driven out of all of their territory within France, minus Calais. Because of this, in 1839, they would both sign a truce. Internal strife within both nations would then stall the war for over a decade. In England, Henry IV would seize the throne, the Scottish would invade, and the Welsh would rebel. In France, the new king, Charles VI, was mentally ill, and 2 factions would fight for power. The Almanacs, led by the king's brother, and the Burgundians, led by the king's cousin. Finally, in 1415, Henry V, the new king of England, had stabilized his country and looked to exploit the turmoil in France. The English would land on the continent and defeat the French at the Battle of Agincourt. During the battle, half of the nobility would be killed, giving the Burgundians a way to take Paris. When the English captured Normandy in 1420, Charles would be forced to marry off his daughter to Henry V and vow that their children would become the new king of France. However, Charles's son would refuse to accept this and would continue to fight. In 1422, both Charles VI and Henry V would die. Although Henry VI, an infant, took the throne of England, nobody would end up taking the throne of France. Meanwhile, in France, the English continued to dominate northern France until they laid siege to Orleans. There, a peasant girl who had claimed to see God would reinvigorate the French, who would then defeat the English and take back Reims before crowning Charles the King. With the momentum of the war changing, the Burgundians signed a favorable peace of France in 1345, leaving the English isolated. Nevertheless, they were still able to hold on for another 15 years, until 1450 when they were defeated by a modernized French army at Normandy. Then, in 1453, the French would win at the Battle of Castellon, forcing the English out of Gascony. The fighting in the war would then come to an end. However, formally the war would not end until 1475. In conclusion, the 100 Years' War was a very long war between the French and the English, and, at the end of the war, it would see France finally united. Thank you for watching this video on the 100 Years' War.